Welcome back to Ball Knowledge. I'm so happy you're here. Today I have something really important that I want to talk to you about, and it's important to keep in mind while we have this conversation that the NFL makes billions from gambling partnerships a year. And the question I have is, are they really being transparent with bettors? And if they're not, does it matter? What I'm about to show you should change the way that you think about the NFL and sports betting. So this week on Twitter or X, I came across former NFL quarterback Kurt Benkert, and he tweeted something that made me really question a deeper foundation of our NFL viewership, NFL strategist, NFL fan, NFL gambler experience. So here's the thing that got everyone talking. The NFL obviously has official partnerships with FanDuel, DraftKings, MGM, Caesars. They're making billions off of us sports betting. And when I say us, I mean fans. But Benkert's recent Twitter thread got me thinking about a very fundamental question. If the NFL is profiting this heavily from gambling, then what do they owe the betting public in terms of transparency? And let me tell you, the timing of this question couldn't be more perfect. Just this past weekend, we saw Jordan Addison mysteriously benched for an entire quarter with, at the time, absolutely zero explanation. So they didn't say anything about it until after the game. No injury report, no prior indication. Fantasy players and bettors were like left in the dark. Well, their NFL, just kept maintaining their gambling revenue. So let me break down what the NFL is actually doing right now, currently, to monitor gambling integrity, because this fascinated me and I had no idea this was going on. The league, the official NFL, has and employs what they call integrity representatives. So these are basically retired FBI agents and executive level police officers. And these guys are stationed at every single game. They're roaming the sidelines, the press box, and it's really interesting. Kathy Lanier, the NFL's senior vice president of security, she told ESPN that these investigators are looking for, quote unquote, anything that is an anomaly, anything that stands out, anything that might raise concerns. So they're monitoring what I think is betting. I think they're trying to monitor betting markets in real time. So they're probably looking for like dramatic odd movements. And I know that they employ a third-party company called Genius Sports to try to catch any suspicious activity. To me, this all feels very arbitrary, but I do admire the effort that they're employing. So it's also pretty telling to think about that the NFL suspended 10 players in 2023 alone for gambling violations. And get this, players themselves cannot bet on NFL games, which I believe makes sense. They cannot enter the sports books during their individual athletic season, and they cannot play daily fantasy football. This language is incredibly arbitrary. But let's remember, meanwhile, the league is plastering gambling ads everywhere, and they're making money hand over fist from these partnerships. So here's where things get even more interesting, and it directly ties into our big question and concern today. The NFL has really, really strict injury reporting policies. So teams, they must legally disclose injured body parts, practice participation, and player game status with the actual verbiage they use is a reasonable degree of specificity. But we've seen just this year and last a lot of controversial situations that exposed the flaws and the kind of arbitrariness of this system. Do you guys remember the Christian McCaffrey situation earlier this season when Jordan Mason was talking to reporters and he revealed after the 49ers game that he knew he was starting on Friday? But McCaffrey at that time was listed up as questionable right up until like an hour before kickoff. And keep in mind, they're both running backs. And that's not even the most egregious example. Joe Burrow, he played with a significant wrist injury last season without it ever being on an injury report initially. And when bettors lost money because of the late game revelation, the outrage was pretty intense. Dave Portnoy famously lost like $120,000 on a Bengals bet, and he threatened to sue. It's a little ridiculous, but clearly people are talking about this. And the NFL, they did investigate both situations and found no violations. But that to me raises another question, like what are the current rules and are they actually sufficient to protect gambling integrity? I'm struggling to see how there's like any through line between the rules that they impose and the ones they enforce through seemingly arbitrary reasons. And this is back to where our point today becomes really critical. The NFL, as we learned, they're actively promoting gambling through partnerships, commercials, integrated content, but they're making betting an integral part of the fan experience at the same time. They're operating under the assumption that every injury report is completely transparent, but we have to remember that these transparency standards were designed decades before, these injury reporting transparency standards were designed decades before sports betting was legal. And really even existed at the scale that it does today. Think about this. The current NFL injury reporting policy was created in 1947 after a commissioner discovered that 5 players had the flu and betting lines shifted dramatically. We're using a 77-year-old framework for a multi-billion-dollar modern gambling ecosystem. Like, make it make sense. And here's what gets me. College sports, you guys, college sports are now implementing their own injury reports specifically because of this gambling boom. The SEC just mandated injury reports for the 2024 season, so they are even on top of this. Even college programs recognize that if you're going to profit from gambling, you better provide some transparency or make it look like you are. Let me show you exactly why the current system is failing bettors, fantasy players, and the NFL as a whole. Nobody's winning here. Teams routinely are using vague designations like personal reasons or disciplinary reasons to wait until the absolute last minute to decide if their player is inactive and report it. The Jordan Addison situation is a perfect example of this, like no prior indication, no injury report, just a random benching that cost fantasy players something and it cost bettors something. Even worse, teams have found a way to game the system. So we have to think about the Atlanta Falcons. They got fined $75,000, and then their coach, Arthur Smith, got fined $25,000 additionally for not reporting that Bijan Robinson was sick before a game, where he only played 11 snaps. They claimed it was just a headache that started Saturday night, but the NFL still found that it violated their policy. So that violates their policy, but Jordan Mason, knowing a week in advance that he was going to play instead of Christian McCaffrey, doesn't. And don't get me even started on the Steelers getting fined because Ben Roethlisberger, this is a while back, missed practice for quote-unquote rest, but he wasn't on the injury report. Then he suffered a season-ending injury in that same game. How do you not believe that those two things are connected to some degree? And I don't think that these are isolated incidences. I think that they're systematic problems, and they are an example of how the current reporting structure isn't benefiting the athletes, the coaching staff, or bettors. And there's a really good point to be made on both sides here. A lot of people are saying, if you're going to have official partnerships with gambling companies, if you're going to integrate betting into your announcing and your broadcasting, if you're going to make millions and billions of dollars from an industry that essentially runs on information. Information is currency in the NFL gambling system and in the world a lot of times. But if you're going to do that, then you have a responsibility to some degree to provide transparency, an agreed upon level of transparency. I personally have a hard time agreeing fully with this. I think that as a sports bettor or a gambler, you have to be willing to take on all elements of risk. And the current system where teams can wait until 90 minutes before kickoff to declare players active or inactive, in the same world where coaches can make personal or disciplinary decisions without explanation, and injury reports can intentionally be vague, that doesn't serve the gambling integrity that the NFL claims to protect, but it also doesn't serve the gamblers if they know too much, because then the game is not a game. Then you are not betting on anything. Like, what are we going to ask next? For the coach to tell us how many plays they're going to run a certain player in? Like, it doesn't quite make sense. So it's a ridiculous example, but like, think about this. Some people like to bet on Groundhog's Day. Okay, great. Is the groundhog going to see its shadow? Well, now what are we going to do? Go ask the trainer, did he sleep well the night before? What mood is he in? Like, it's a ridiculous example, but as gamblers and fans, we have to leave some things to chance. And trying to control too much takes the purpose and like the finite point of gambling out of it. Like, you'll cross a line at some point. And so that's why I have a hard time with this. But something that is problematic to me on another side is the unequal access to information. So you can argue both sides here. Team insiders and medical staff, like, they all know information that could significantly impact betting odds, but that information isn't shared with the public. But yet that public is being encouraged to bet on these players on these specific games. So in that sense, like, I do see both sides. Some legal experts have even argued that sports bettors should have legal action taken when teams violate injury reporting policies. But in the past, courts haven't been receptive to this. It hasn't gotten any legs, but the fact that it's even being discussed, to me, shows how serious this issue has become and why it's worth us pondering on this question. So like after thinking about this, I'm thinking, okay, what's the solution? And I think the NFL has to take a stance. If they're gonna profit from us as fans gambling, they need to adopt standards that actually serve gambling integrity and not just pay lip service. But in that same token, gamblers also need to be okay to take risks and not manipulate the power imbalance of information to make gambling about something that it isn't, you know? And the reality that this conversation is highlighting is that the NFL has changed its relationship with gambling. No duh. We're doing paid sponsorships now. We're integrating it into broadcasters. But it hasn't changed its responsibilities to match. They're taking gambling money while operating under 1977 gambling transparency standards. And unfortunately, that's not sustainable for either party. And I don't think it's a problem right now, in this day and age, personally. But I would be willing to hedge a lot that as the NFL grows even bigger internationally, as any corporation is under orders to do, more money, more growth, more revenue, then we're going to see, guaranteed, this need for monetization and gambling partnerships growing. Because the NFL has to grow. How are they going to do it? They can't birth more people into the world to watch football. They're going to profit other ways. So this is going to become a larger conversation. So we have to just see what they do. The league spent decades fighting against gambling, but then all of a sudden, now we're embracing it completely when it became legal and profitable. But they haven't fully embraced the responsibility that comes with that relationship. They're monitoring, we know, suspicious betting activity. We're educating players about gambling policy. Okay. They're working with integrating third-party companies to monitor security. Okay, I'm not going to speak on the efficacy of that, but it's an effort in the right direction. But they're not providing the basic transparency standards or holding any sort of standard for injury reporting or transparency that actually can be a benchmark of trustworthiness. And if the NFL wants to profit from gambling, I think they have to do this. They have to do this correctly, not with 1947 age policies and loopholes, but with real transparency that's going to protect people if they're being encouraged to bet. If gamblers want to legally bet on the NFL, then we also need to be able to accept that what information we're being given about the game is the information that we get and making a decision financially based on that. It's a very nuanced argument that I want to hear you guys weigh in on. And the real question, what do you owe the gambling public when you're making millions off of them? I don't know. What do you think? Should the NFL be held to a higher transparency standard if they're making money from partnerships? Let me know what you think. I think that this is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the way that this conversation is going to evolve, because anyone that's worked for a corporation knows that there always has to be more. More viewers, more money, more ads, more high-paying ads. It always has to grow. That's why we're seeing the NFL make a big play to expand internationally. Because in America, there's only so much that you can do with the viewers that you have. If you've ever looked into the history of how Meta, formerly Facebook, grew, there was a huge bridge that they had to get, a huge gap that they had to bridge when they had almost every person in America registered to a Facebook account in the Americas, Canada, etc. But then they had this big challenge where they had to expand globally, because that's the only way you can grow. If you are answering to investors and stockholders and shareholders and a board, there's no way that they're going to say, oh great, you have everyone in America using your product, you're done. That's not how it works. You always have to grow. So in my eyes, the NFL is making a huge play internationally because more money, more revenue, more eyes, more sales of gear and like swag and all these things, and like logo sales and logo IPOs and IPs, like any intellectual property and brand identity that the NFL has, they're going to sell it internationally. But that also is only one stream and one way they can do that. The other way they're going to do that, and that they already have begun to do that, is to let us legally bet on the game. So tip of the iceberg, you guys. I think there's going to be a lot more where this comes from, and the NFL, when they finish this year's season, they're probably going to have a real conversation about like what rules they're going to enforce with gambling, how much the injury reports are really monitored for accuracy and clarity. We shall see. And I could ramble on about it forever. It's a fascinating topic. But let me know what you guys think. If you're a gambler yourself, do you feel like you demand this transparency? Do you feel like it's important to like your strategy? Or do you feel like your strategy remains the same whether Jordan Addison is benched for the first half or not? it's interesting to think about. In the meantime, I'm so grateful that you came along on this conversation with me. Stay healthy and stay safe, and I'm really excited to watch this weekend's games, and I'll be back with you on TikTok and on YouTube next week to talk a little bit more about the issues that are really interesting to us as NFL fans and strategists. So I will talk to you soon. Bye.